mentioned it to any length, so to speak. And
but what about your language, your French language background, since that's really what we're here to talk about today?
I had 4 years of French in high school. French was my language on my master's, and French was one of my languages on my doctorate, but that's about it. I'll let the French-speaking pros take over for that.
Angie.
Well, I have no French myself, but I do know my grandmother said that her father spoke Creole, did not speak English at all. So I'm very interested in learning about this.
Bernard?
So I took French in high school and a bit in college. My grandfather often spoke about the French Creole on Louis Island that our relatives would speak there. I, through this organization, have an app on my phone, Memorize, that was talking about, and I started taking some of the Kouri-Vini courses there just through some of the actual adjectives, and that's about it.
Sean.
I have, I'll let y'all see me for a second. I have no French background as far as language at all. No, and also as far as my ancestral background, my Creole background is connected to actually Spanish Creoles, so Gomez's. So so I don't know if Dr. Landry knows much about that. But anyway, but yeah, very limited background.
Lizzie.
Creole background is connected to actually Spanish Creoles, so Gomez's.
Technical problems. I was born in France.
I don't know if
moved to the States when I was 9, but I don't have any Creole background that I know of.
But your French language, how fluent are you?
Less fluent than I was at 9 years old when we came here from disuse. I can still manage.
All right. Linda. Oh, sorry.
I have absolutely none. I married a Creole, so that's how I got involved in all of this. So I'm still learning. It's still a learning process for me.
Greg.
I have a little breakfast in my mouth, for which I apologize. It's a donut, for which I do not apologize. My interest in French has been...
at least been a French toast.
My interest in French goes back quite a long way, but I have never taken French. My mom and my sister both speak French, but I've never taken it. My experience of Creole French goes back all the way to last night when I looked up a YouTube video on speaking Creole French. And when Dr. Christophe Landry came up on the screen, I thought, well, I'm going to learn all this tomorrow. So I got a little preview last night.
Great. Melissa.
Yeah, I actually speak Spanish more just in terms of my education, and I've lived in South America. But my grandfather, who's from Mobile, always told me about his mother's family, who's actually originally from Theodore, which is right, near Mobile. And the original town name was named after them. Their last name was Clement. And so he always told me about how they spoke French in their family, and they originally came from Haiti. So I've always had an interest in just trying to learn more about it. But because we're so many generations removed, I did not grow up listening to it.
Ray.
Hello, everyone. My background in French or Creole, my family is from the Axis Chastain area, and my aunt used to tell me that her grandmother spoke French. When I was in high school, I took 2 years of French, and in college, I took 2 years of French. And I had a chance to go to Haiti when I was in high school. And, you know, it was my senior year, and I spoke a little bit of French and was able to understand. But with that 4 years, I don't speak much anymore. J'ai parlé français un peu.
C'est bien quand même.
Oui, oui.
Barja.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Let's see, as far as my French language background, I took, 2 semesters or 2 years in high school. And then when I went to college at Spring Hill, I took 2 semesters there. Am I fluent? No, many, many years removed from speaking or reading French. And as far as family history background, not sure. I know my DNA percentages keep changing with ancestry. But as far as any Creole, I don't know of that at all. And, well, French Creole in my family.
Yay. Well, and for me, I just, je ne sais pas français. That's all I know. I took 2 years of Spanish in high school and another year of Spanish in college. And so, you know, se habla español. So, yeah, so that's where I am. But I'm excited, and I follow along with you, Christophe. So, you and Brian grabbed me.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so.
Good.
But let's reintroduce you a little bit. So if you'll share, you know, a little bit about yourself, and then get started.
Good morning, everybody, on this Saturday morning. I'm Christophe Landry. I'm from New Iberia, Louisiana. I've been gone for quite a long time, since 2004. I went first to Brazil. I was working at the university there with petroleum engineering students, helping sort of with language questions. And then I moved to New York City. I was working as a flight attendant, international flight attendant from New York City, Newark actually, to French and Portuguese speaking destinations. I did that for several years, and then I got bored and decided to go back to the university and did my doctorate in England in American history. And since then, I've been here at Ancestry in Salt Lake City. I'm a research manager here. I specialize in genealogy of the Latin world, so that obviously includes Louisiana Creoles, which is really sort of my specialty, but it's branched off, as you guys all are aware. We're related to mostly everyone in the Latin world because of migration patterns and things like that, so it makes sense. And on the side, I do quite a bit with language recovery in Louisiana in the current sense, but also in the broader sense, diasporic sense, as well as in colonial sense. And that necessarily includes Mobile, because Mobile and Biloxi and the Gulf Coast were part of Louisiana, the colony, for quite a number of years. So, and you've maintained lots of Creole cultural features since, when was it, 1770, 1771, when you guys became British, because of clustering of Creole communities in Alabama and Mississippi Gulf Coast. You've retained lots of cultural features. I see a common theme in your explaining, you know, your access and history with Creole language and French language, which is that the grandparents tend to be the last generation where it was spoken. And then from there, English. And there are some historical, political reasons for that, which we're going to go over just a bit. So basically, the presentation today is going to be a mixture of the evolution of the Creole language and also the politics behind language and identity in Louisiana that led to sort of its decline, and then later social media that helped to reinvigorate the language, which I've been part of. And that latter part is going to include some linguistic lessons, and you guys are going to have to speak, so be prepared. Greg, you'll have to finish your donut. Okay, all right, so let's begin here. So the 18th century really is the catalyst for Creole language evolution in Louisiana colony. And I like to look at it as the 18th century of ingredients, and what Richard Guidry, who was a Francophone language activist in Louisiana, used to call le grand mélangement, the big mixing. And so this is going to follow sort of like a historical timeline. I'm sorry if you guys don't like history, because it's like full of dates and timelines and things like that, but it's really important because it's through the dates and the timeline that we get to understand the ingredients and how they eventually fused to create this language, which became known as Creole. So all of you guys are aware that Louisiana more broadly at that time included everything from the Gulf Coast all the way up to essentially the Great Lakes. And it was part of 3 colonies of France at the time, Canada, which is today called Quebec, Acadia to the east, and then of course Upper and Lower Louisiana. Massive, massive territory. And some key early dates. So 1685-ish, colony was claimed for France, of course, by Cavalier de la Salle, jurisdiction of Quebec, not really settled at that point. It was not settled permanently until 1699. Fort Maurepas near Biloxi, which you guys are probably aware of, 1702 as well, La Mobile, founded by Iberville, 1714, Les Natchitoches, Natchitoches. Lots of people imagine that New Orleans, or even Baton Rouge maybe, were the first cities in proper Louisiana proper, but it was actually Natchitoches, and they're quite proud of that. 1718, New Orleans was founded, and 1 year later came the official slave trade. 1720, Opelousas, 29, Point Coupé, which is New Roads in Avoyelles Parish, and then 1762 became a Spanish province. In 1803, a U.S. territory. So looking at early censuses of New Orleans and Mobile, the demographics mean a lot in terms of Creole language evolution. So New Orleans in just a second, I'm gonna minimize this so I can see myself. 1721 in New Orleans, as you can see, there were 240 white Francophone men, 140 white Francophone women, 96 children. There were engagés as well, 156, and 533 slaves. So that's 3 years after the slave trade officially began, and 51 Native American Indian slaves. In Mobile, somewhat similar, but a smaller population, 119, 95 women, 113 children, 22 engagés, 247 African slaves, and 110 Indian slaves. So you can see it's somewhat 50-50 at this point, but in the next few years, things really start to change. So in Tchoupitoulas, which is to the west of New Orleans, that's present-day Jefferson Parish, this is just a breakdown of like 10 of the inhabitants there, and you can clearly see that there are many more slaves at the Tchoupitoulas district post. 30 African slaves for Beaulieu, 53 for his brother, de la Frinière, and it goes on and on. And this I only included just to show you that outside of the towns themselves, so New Orleans and Mobile, you have many more African slaves there. And this is important in terms of what happens next for Creole language development. So again, 1721 we looked at just previously, but 1726 you can see that even in New Orleans the slave population starts to increase. Of course, the slave trade was in full swing by this point. And so we get this influx of newcomers who were in bondage, of course, slaves. 118 slaves in New Orleans, Tchoupitoulas 396, 214 in, on the opposite bank of Tchoupitoulas, and so on and so forth. So the slave population is growing rapidly. Just below here in 1731, 1732, look at the difference in the opposite Tchoupitoulas in 1726, in 1731-32, 214 in 1726, and 1,227 counted for in 1731, 1732. So it exploded. And really, this is what I wanted to show you with these early census records. And we know quite a bit through research like Dr. Hall's about where these slaves were coming from. This comes from her database, and it's one of the charts that you can actually download from the website that shows the different regions of West Africa and Central Eastern Africa where those early slaves were coming from. So we have a large amount from Central Africa, which is in the yellow here, and quite a bit from Senegambia. Okay, so this is just for Point Coupé, so new roads during the Spanish period. So what happens is during the French period, which is 1699 through 1762, we get a large number of slaves that are coming from Senegambia, which is Senegal, Gambia, Mali. During the Spanish period, it shifts more so to Central Eastern Africa, lots of Congo slaves during that period. And this is sort of showing the difference in the regional makeup in the slaves in Point Coupé during the Spanish period. And we somewhat see similar trends elsewhere. So all this to say that fortunately in Louisiana's case, Louisiana including Mobile and Mississippi at the time, we know quite a bit about the slaves in terms of their ethnic background. So, you know, whereas in other European colonies, slaves were just marked by the name slave, or maybe a name or a physical descriptor or a racial descriptor, at least here we have some idea about their ethnic background. So this is a slave inventory from a succession in St. Martin Parish in 1791. The estate was actually probated in New Orleans, but the inhabitant actually lived in St. Martin Parish. And in the record, it's written in Spanish, which is typical of the Spanish period. Administrators sort of enforced that the records, especially in New Orleans, be written in Spanish, but in some of the outlying districts, they could be written in French or in Spanish. This one's in Spanish. And if we look at the 16 slaves here that are inventoried, we clearly see the ethnic groups for each one of them. Luis, Creole, Pedro, Creole. So this is Louisiana Creole, probably. Juan, Ibu, Mercure, Poulard, and it goes on and on and on. But you see lots of Congo. You see Creole that's written as an ethnicity for the slaves. And you see Guinea, you see Ibu, and others. So knowing this helps to understand some of the ingredients we will eventually have in what becomes Louisiana French, as well as in Creole language. As far as the Francophones are concerned, because they're a major part of the gumbo that we're talking about, this linguistic gumbo. And so in terms of the Francophones, they tend to come from 7 basic areas of Europe. Canada, of course, Quebec in the Illinois country, but they came via France as well. And in France proper, we have Brittany, Poitou-Charentes, Normandy, the Rhône Alpes region, Acadie, of course, via Poitou-Charentes and the Loire Valley, in Wallonie, which is in southern Francophone Belgium. And in each of these regions of Europe, Francophone Europe, they had their own languages and their own dialects at this point. So the way that we think of French today didn't really exist back then. And so you'll notice in the presentation, I have French in quotation marks, because this French that we think of as French today didn't really sort of come about until after 1888, when there was a political movement that created that in France. So this is just a regional map of France. It gives you a sort of geographic idea of these regions that I previously mentioned, Poitou-Charentes and Bretagne. Okay, so lots from the West Coast, sorry. Okay, specifically these 3, 4, okay. And also from the 4 east. I'm gonna play this really quickly, if I can. It just gives you an idea of what some of these languages in regional dialects survived in France despite the 1888 movement to consolidate and create like a standardized version of French. And so we can hear some of these dialects in languages even still today. And I want to play just a couple seconds of them for you, because it will help to inform why we actually sound the way we sound in part in Louisiana French and also in Creole. Okay, so that gives you a good idea. And if you've heard anyone speaking Louisiana French today, you probably have recognized lots of similar intonation, rhythm, and things like that. This is actually a documentary that was done on the work of Richard Guidry, who I referenced earlier. Le Grand Mélangement is the name of the documentary, but it's also something that Richard used to say about what created this Creole culture that we have in Louisiana today. It's this big mixture. And they're speaking in Louisiana French, so I just want you to pay attention just for a few seconds on how it sounds, the rhythm, and how it relates to the previous video that we just listened to.
Ma famille vient de la France.
Dr. Landry, that audio is not coming across.
Oh, you guys can't hear it?
No. Yeah, you'll probably have problems getting across this format. At least
Oh, right.
the video, but we can't hear it.
Same thing for the previous one?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Oops. Let's see. Maybe we'll have to. I'll send it over in after the presentation so you guys can hear it. Yeah, because I'm not sure how to regulate that.
Yeah, sometimes that works best when you play it directly from your hard drive. When you have a file that's on your hard drive and play directly from it, usually it transfers better.
Okay. Actually, we can. I will do this. I will go to YouTube.
That may not work either if you play it directly from YouTube. That probably won't work.
No, it won't either?
I doubt it, yeah.
Okay, all right. All right, sorry about that, guys. Well, the whole point, the whole point here was that the intonations, the vocabulary, the rhythm, and things like that, which are major components of the language features in Louisiana French and Creole, today come from these regions of Europe. And you can hear them. I'll send you guys the links after, and then you can go and listen to them together. Okay, so these are the major components of the demographic components and also the cultural components of colonial Louisiana. We have the Francophone Europeans on the one hand. Some of them came directly from France, others came through Quebec, and then later also there were Acadians who arrived after 1756. Then we also have the West and Central Eastern Africans who arrived with their own cultural backgrounds. We unfortunately don't have many we don't have any recordings of what their languages sounded like at that time. Some of those languages no longer exist. But we do know that they carried their cultural traditions with them, and that includes some of the linguistic features that we're going to see in a moment. And of course, also the Native Americans. So also during the 17th century, when this gumbo was being created, we also see the rise of a new identity and a new language. So, premier créole né dans cette colonie. So this was on the death entry for Robert Talon, who was actually born in 1685 at sea between Galveston Bay and Fort Maurepas. He was the son of Quebecers who had actually gone down to Galveston to claim land for France and to try to create some sort of colony down there. It didn't work well. Lots of them were killed. The ones who survived actually went back up to Canada, but he was born en route back to Canada. So he was born between Galveston and Mobile. And when he died in 1746 in Mobile, his death record reads, first Creole born in this colony. I am surrounded by Mobile Creole, so I wouldn't doubt if many of you descend from him. I descend from him. And so it's pretty neat to see that. So Creole is this new identity. And people today sort of think that, you know, Creole identity is something only for people think this in English. only that people of color have, but actually no, that's not the case. And so there are mounds and mounds and mounds of records that show that this was an identity that was applied to people of only European ancestry, people of only African ancestry, and people of both. So it had nothing to do with the genealogy. It had more so to do with being born in the colony, being Latin in the colony, in the sense that you were practicing Roman Catholic, you spoke a Romance-based language, and you were from the colony. And so this is how Creole was used at that time. So we see references, for example, for slaves, neg Creole. Neg, I know the cognate in English, the N word comes to mind, but that's, and perhaps at that moment it was used in a similar sense, but since then, it is just a physical descriptor for someone who's dark brown complected. Neg Creole. So there were two slaves who in 1764 and 1765 were termed Creoles, and this is according to Dr. Mitlow Hall's database. The slave in the 1764 document, whose name was Sozy, was born in 1734 at the Point Coupé post and belonged to the lady Grondel. The second slave, Louis, was born in Mobile in 1740. So remember, the slave trade officially started in 1718. By 1740, you have people already identified as Creoles, okay? Because by that point, you had the first generation of the children of the slaves born in the colony, somewhat 20 years later. And at the same time of this new identity being created and applied and used, Creole, there is also Creolization linguistically that's happening. And at the linguistic level, there are basically three hypotheses about how this happens. There's the monogenesis hypothesis, which is that there was a Creole language that existed on the coast of West Africa that was brought over through the slaves. And then the second is the Caribbean diffusion hypothesis, which is that Creole language developed in the Caribbean, but then through slave trade, commercial enterprises, migration, that it was diffused throughout the French-speaking colonies. And so Louisiana, as a colony of France, would have been part of this network and would have then received the language through this way. And then the third, and the newest, is that the Creole language is actually indigenous to Louisiana, that it had these features, it had the sort of ingredients that came from these different places, including the Caribbean, including West Africa, including Canada and Francophone Europe, but that ultimately the way that it's spoken in Louisiana is indigenous to Louisiana. And by Louisiana, again, I'm including Alabama, Mobile, in southern Mississippi. I tend to support Dr. Klingler's hypothesis because there is no sort of tangible record supporting the idea that the language sort of was imported from someplace else. Everything seems to point to Louisiana proper as the birthplace of this language, this Creole language. So Chaudonson says that société d'habitation and société de plantation, that these are two different types of plantation societies that exist in the colonies at this point. And he says that plantations are large numbers. So for the plantation, large number of plantations, it's a sign of a mature colony, limited interaction between the master and the slave, because the slaves would be working in the fields, and then the masters would be in the big house or working in sort of craft or business or things like that. And so there would be limited interaction between the two. And so in that context, the slave would not have ample opportunity to learn to speak French fluently. And so he would get bits and pieces of the language, and then this would in turn create the Creole language. Large numbers of imported slaves who ultimately created a method of communication. Pidgin is the linguistic term for that, where this limited form of language between people of different language backgrounds is only used in the context of, well, I have to speak to this master, you know, we have to, I need some eggs, or I need whatever. And so, you know, you just use sort of like what some would consider elementary forms to express whatever it is that you need. And then that's it. That's a pidgin that approximates the dominant language taught to new slaves. At some point, it becomes a mother tongue. And linguists tend to say that when a pidgin becomes a mother tongue, that is the point when it is officially a Creole language, because it's a stable language with complex features. You can express complex ideas. So we can kind of see how the formation of Creole happens in terms of comparison with French. So on the left-hand side, we have, and again, I have French in parentheses, the pronouns for French for I, you, he, she, we, you, y'all, they is je, tu, il, elle, on, nous, vous, il, elle, okay? And then Kouri-Vini, Creole, it becomes mo, to, li, no, zot, ye. Those pronouns in Kouri-Vini come from another type of pronoun, or it's an object pronoun that it comes from in French rather than the subject pronoun. Object pronouns are my, your, his, her, and in French those are moi, toi, lui, nous, vous, eux. Okay, and so you can see how Kouri-Vini, the mo comes from moi, the to comes from toi, the li comes from lui, no comes from nous, zot comes from vous zot, it's another form of vous, and ye comes from eux. Even at the conjugation level of verbs, we see changes, but they're sort of recognizable. So for the verb to do, for example, in French, in the present tense, je fais, I do, or I make, je fais, mo fait. I did, j'ai fait, mo t'ai fait. Okay? So the conjugations, we can kind of make out the origins of them in these earlier French forms, but they take on a very specific function in Creole that is very stable. It's part of the rules. Everyone does it. It's not some sort of pidgin where you can just like make things up. It's really a permanent feature of the language. And we also get these tenses that change through tense markers that we'll look at maybe in a few seconds. So what's the earliest written evidence of Creole that we have? Well, 1748. Où toi couris, Charlot, pendant que nous dînons? Where did you go, Charlot, when we were eating? So in French today, that would be tu es allé où, Charlot, pendant notre dîner? And in earlier French, what I call earlier French, but Louisiana French, Canadian sort of non-standard French, à où t'as été, Charlot, pendant on mangeait? Okay, so we can see how it's related to French. It has all these French words, but the placement of the words is different than it is in French. The syntax is different. Again, in 1751, 1762, we have an example, written example. Blanc là, li pas fait mal à moi. Pourquoi toi voulais moi faire mal à lui? The white man did nothing wrong to me, so why should I do anything bad to him? And again, in French, it would be le blanc ne m'a rien fait de mal. Pourquoi je devrais lui faire du mal? Or in earlier French or Louisiana French, le blanc m'a pas fait rien de mal, quoi faire je devrais lui faire de mal. Okay, so we can see that they're related, but they're not the same, right? They're not the same. 1748, 1751, 1762. That's early. That's one generation, 1.5 generations after the first African slaves officially arrived in Louisiana in 1719. So it only took one generation for this language to form, and we have, there are not many, but a couple examples of how they were used in spoken at that time. This is 50, 60 years before the influx of the massive influx of Saint-Domingan refugees during the Haitian Revolution. So there are lots of ideas that are sprouting around that Creole in Louisiana comes from Haiti. No, actually, it's been around long before the Haitian refugees arrived. And so for this reason, I support Dr. Klingler's position on where this language comes from. All things point to Louisiana as its genesis point. Who also spoke Kouri-Vini then? I'll explain why I use Kouri-Vini later in the presentation. It's a synonym for Creole in this case. So this is written in 1792, point coupé. The Creole language, which is a mixture of that of the Blacks and French, which is, so this is translated also from French into English, which is pronounced with great diversity. They do not understand either the real French language or English. They had no reason to understand English. I mean, Louisiana was a Spanish colony in 1792, and before that it was a French colony. So of course they didn't understand English, but they all understand and can explain themselves perfectly well in Creole, which language is not known by all the French and English settlers of the province. But I, the witness, who was white, and the notary, who was also white, who assisted at the interrogation, know it very well. So I share this to show that, to dispel these myths about it being a secret slave language and a language that only people of color spoke, because it was and still is today spoken by many, many white identified locals. It has nothing to do with the color of the skin at all. Many Cajuns today are native speakers of this language rather than French. I included this one just to give you sort of an idea of where these regions are in Louisiana that we've spoken about. So Point Coupé is here. Point Coupé is here. Acadia country is here. This is where roughly where the Tchoupitoulas was in this area, just after, between the German coast and what was later called Orleans County. I'm from here, of course, and these are regions. Today, these are the last remaining regions where Creole is spoken in Louisiana proper. Okay, so then we get into the 19th century. So we get the strengthening sense of Creole community and the beginnings of Americanization, and the strengthening of Creole community and identity comes from, at this point, so this is sort of like a second catalyst. The first was colonization itself. The second one is the Louisiana Purchase or Louisiana Abandonment, whichever term works for you. When Louisiana was admitted to the United States, to the Union as a state in 1812, the legislature, by law, did things in French and in English. And so this is just giving you an example of the type of pamphlets that they printed for the legislative sessions in Louisiana. This one is from 1863. But as you can see, it's in English on the left and in French on the right. I'm gonna skip this one. In the 19th century also, Creole language was not this sort of obscure language that was used in voodoo rituals and, you know, in the kitchens and things like that. It was used all over the place, and people throughout the colonies knew of its existence. Lots of people in many places spoke it as a native language alongside French. And so it was also used in literary form. So we see in newspapers from the 19th century, the language in different literary forms being presented. This is an example of a song, a poem that was printed in the newspaper in Abbeville, Louisiana in 1878, and it's called Zozo Mocha Chanteur, and that's a mockingbird, and it's a really cute. I wish I had more time. I could read it for you, but I can do it after if you'd like in the Q&A. But this is just to give you an example of how the language had some visibility at the time, and that it was used in these sort of complex ways, and that it was not just some sort of elementary language that people used here and there in any sort of way. If you have poetry and short stories and folk tales and songs in the language, then you know that the range of the language is quite wide. And so this is just an example of that. But we also know that the Civil War brought on a sort of binary form of political function in society. And in Louisiana in particular, where there was lots of mixing, lots of crossover, cross-pollination, that sort of muddied the waters in terms of binary racialism. After the Civil War, it became extremely important, obviously, to divide along a binary racial line in Louisiana. And so in this 1873 article, D'un côté ou de l'autre, this editor is saying that Louisianians can no longer continue this mixing thing, and Louisianians must decide whether they're going to be a white Louisianian or a black Louisianian. And this is going to have consequences on the language, both French and Creole, being passed on, but also having an important function in society. So if we look at the legislature of Louisiana at the time, the composition in terms of the legislators' ethnic background, we see how the language rights for French, and by extension Creole, decreases when the number or the percentage of Creole legislators decreases. So in 1812, 56% of the legislature was Creole. 1845, 35%. 1852, 35% again, okay? But we see that the laws start to become more restrictive. So we go from all state documents but must be written in English. In 1812, 1845, the Constitution and state laws published bilingually. 1852, Article 101, Secretary of the Senate and Clerk of the House of Representatives shall be conversant with the French and English languages, and members may address either house in either language. 1864, on the eve of the end of the Civil War, Creole delegates 18%, English made only judicial, civil, and educational language. 1879, public education in both English and French. So this is during the sort of latter years of Reconstruction, but during that period, there were some gains for Creoles culturally, but also obviously politically and economically. So French came back into the picture briefly at the legislative level. And then in 1898, it starts to wane again. So general exercises in the public schools shall be conducted in English. In 1921, state laws and records published exclusively in English. Okay, so we can see that there's a relationship between the percentage of Creole delegates in the legislature as it pertains to language laws and our protections of French, and by extension Creole, at the governmental level. 20th century rolls around, and it's profoundly a bifurcating period in black and white. The 19th century started that process, but really in the 20th century, that's when racialization really starts to harden. And so tensions mount to enforce racial caste. In 1905, there was a native of Opelousas who had been born to a free woman of color, and a Jewish Frenchman who moved to Houston and was living as white in the community in Houston. Someone from Opelousas recognized him there and reported him to the local police that he was passing as white, and that this obviously was an infringement, legal infringement. So the police force in Houston didn't do much about it. So again, that Opelousas native who had seen him living as white reported it to the paper in Opelousas, and they posted this big article about, basically outing him, that Harry Block was living in Houston as a white man, and everyone in Opelousas who's been around for the last 2 generations knew his mother and grandmother, and they presented his genealogy and even described what his mother and grandmother's physical features were like. And ultimately, the goal was for him to sort of be penalized for living as white in Houston. It ricocheted because the Houston officials said, well, we've always known him as white. People respect him in this society, and therefore it is what it is. So it didn't work in this case, but that's just to show you that people were really thinking about the binary racial divide and how to control who had access to what in society, and race was the defining feature. 1910, in response to the Octave and Josephine Treadway case in Louisiana in 1909, the majority Anglophone Louisiana legislature enacted racial binarism, preventing marriages across the binary color line, and prevented transfer of property from persons of the white to those of the black race, and made such offenses a felony. Guilty parties were criminalized and suffered brutal public condemnation. So this is sort of like the backdrop of the Henry Block affair, that, this stuff was happening, and laws are being passed to prevent them from happening. As this is happening, you also have many Creoles who are white identified, but don't identify as American, because of course American at that time, and even still for French speakers and Creole speakers in Louisiana, is representative of Anglo Protestantism. So if you're Americain, then you speak English and you're Protestant. Okay, so that's different from being American. American is the nationality. You have the passport. You live in the United States, you were born in the United States, but Americain is the Anglophone Protestant. And so there were all these anxieties for them too, because they were trying to find a space for themselves in this white and black society, but they didn't want to necessarily be soaked up by Americain, and they didn't want to become Americain either. And so you get these movements in the 20th century that are gonna showcase this turmoil, identity crisis within the community. So to escape being associated with blackness, because Creole in English had this connotation, which of course would marginalize and impoverish them, many Creoles in urban centers began to identify as French. Other Creoles, especially in rural Southwest Louisiana, began to look at Acadia and propose calling themselves the Louisiana Acadians. This is in the 20s, 1920s. Both sets of Creoles were middle class and elite who were part of this movement, identity movement. Middle class and elite, and both sought to whiten themselves by looking to Canada and to France, because of course Canada and France, if you're a Canadian, then there was slavery in Canada, especially for Native Americans earlier, and later there were a few of African descent who were slaves. But ultimately, when people think of Canadians, you think white. When you think of Europe, you think white. So those two particular places were very useful in this movement because it signified whiteness. And so you were distancing yourselves consciously from any sort of touch of the tar brush, so to speak. This is also when the Evangeline icon became a real thing in terms of Louisiana memory. Incidentally, this is also when French Creole as a term comes about, both representing the language and also identity, because again, you emphasize French and you're emphasizing whiteness. And so French was appendaged to Creole at this point. In the languages themselves, in Creole and in French, no one referred to themselves as Créole Français. It didn't exist, it still doesn't. But this was used in English for this purpose, and it came about mostly through this period and only in English. In 1968, one of the members of the group of activists that I just mentioned from Southwest Louisiana, in 1968 created the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, and that agency really sought to re-institutionalize French, but to use French as an economic tool in Louisiana, because the cane industry was failing at that time. And so politicians, economists were, sort of trying to figure out, okay, what can we do to remedy this situation? And so James de Mongeau, who created this agency, looked to French as a way to diversify the economy and to use French as a way to do that. That was in 1968. 1971, after the civil rights movement and also during the ethnic pride movement, you get further divide in the Creole community in Louisiana. So the earlier Louisiana Acadian movement sort of dissipated quite a bit after the 1920s, and then it was sort of reborn in the late 1960s and early 1970s, ironically to oppose the earlier movement from the 1920s, which was very middle class, very white, very highbrow. And poor white French speakers in Louisiana felt that they were isolated from this movement. And so they sort of reappropriated the term Cajun, which was a slur up until that point, as an identity, and created this flag, which is on the left, which they termed the flag of Acadiana, Acadiana being all of the civil parishes of South Louisiana, excluding New Orleans, Plaquemine, and a couple others. And it was a legislative constituency as well, so it wasn't really about all the parishes that have anything to do with Acadia, but it was more so about this legislative caucus that was being created, which was called Acadiana. At the same time, in 1987, you have a reaction from Creoles who had been excluded from the Cajun movement of the 1970s and who had retained the Creole identity. And they, in 1987, through an organization called Creole Inc., based in Lafayette, had this flag on the right created for the organization. And now people use it as representing the flag of Louisiana Creoles. we start to see more engagement with Creole-ness in the university at this time too. Very racially sort of segregated. If you're speaking about Creoles at this point, you're speaking about Creoles of color, especially in history and anthropology. We see the same thing in linguistics. The Dictionary of Louisiana Creole was published at that point. By linguists, Debbie Clifton, Sybil Kine. Those are sort of like two of the big names in terms of Creole, academic Creoles at that time. Ulysse Ricard was another one as well. And then we get, so the language is waning at this point. You know, more people, like all of you have mentioned, your grandparents were actually speaking the language, but didn't teach your parents, and you don't know the languages either. While the identity was sort of resurging in English. So there was a sort of kickstart in the early 2000s through social media to bring the Creole language back. And this is because of the rise of Cajun-ness in terms of economy. There was more interest and more money being pumped into Cajun-ness. And as a result, everything that was related to Creole was being sort of forgotten about. And so I and some others wanted to do something about it, and that's exactly what we did. In 2008, I started teaching Creole on this website that no longer exists. It was called Edufire, and it was a virtual learning space where you can, it had really great tools. You could teach classes, all sorts of classes and things like that. I did that just to test sort of the interest in the language at that point, and the response was really overwhelming for me. I couldn't keep up, and so I ended up having to stop the classes. The website also closed shortly after that. So then I brought it to Facebook because that's where everyone was turning to. Facebook. There was the fan page that I created here, and I was so I transferred the classes from Edufire to these Facebook private groups, and they were arranged in terms of beginner, intermediate, advanced, and things like that. And so it was like a siphoning portal that we did in Facebook. And so I can't show you guys these. This is too bad because these are, so as part of the assignments in the classes, the learners or relearners, for a lot of them, had these assignments where they had to speak and say certain things. And these are really cute 5 examples of their project where they're speaking in Creole. I'll try to figure out a way for you guys to see it. It's too bad I can't show you. At that same time, when we noticed that there was a lot of interest in the language, we also wanted to sort of figure out a way to remedy the nomenclature issues, because by that point in English, again in English, you had some people referring to the language as Creole French, you had others saying French Creole, you had others just saying Creole, you had others saying French, some people were calling it Kouri-Vini, others calling it Gombo, and the list goes on and on and on. And of course, the issue with so many different names is that it becomes difficult for you to unify everyone who's actually speaking the exact same language, but they think because there are all these different names that there's sort of different qualities to the language based on which term is being used. And SIL is an organization that manages the registration for international coding of standardized languages. So these are codes that are used in all sort of settings throughout the world. And there's a code for each language. Louisiana Creole had a code at that time, but it was registered under, I can't remember what the name was. I think French Creole maybe. But we wanted to bring more unity, more clarity to the movement. And so in 2014, we petitioned SIL so that the language would be recognized as Louisiana Creole, which was granted in 2015. At that same time, we were also in dialogue with UNESCO, which is, of course, the cultural heritage arm of the United Nations. They published this sort of dictionary encyclopedia of languages throughout the world, of endangered languages, and we wanted to get Creole on in this encyclopedia, in this dictionary, because by that point there were less than 10,000 native speakers or even bilingual speakers of the language, and so that is firmly in critically endangered language status, and that has not been announced yet, but it was granted in February of 2016. This was important for us also because through the United Nations, through UNESCO, it would enable us to be able to apply and qualify for certain projects in things that would help to reinvigorate the language. Not long after that, so 2018, 2017, no, earlier, 2016, Rushton James created this website, Louisiana Creole Dictionary, which essentially took the entries from the printed Dictionary of Louisiana Creole, which I showed you guys, and placed it inside here, except that we changed the way that it was written. The printed dictionary was published in Haitian Creole orthography, and we, by that point, had started creating and had created an orthography that was specific to Louisiana Creole itself, that took bits and pieces from French, from English, from Haitian Creole even, that would be consolidated in an orthography that had recognizable forms for people who are relearning the language through English, because most Creoles today are speaking English. This is a free dictionary. Anyone can go there, louisianacreoledictionary.com. It's constantly being updated, so there may be terms that you would like to be in there that are not in there. You can suggest them to the website, and then they will be added. All right, so we can finally look at this language. What does it look like? Okay, so I, you, he, she, it, we, all, y'all, they. I touched on it just a little bit earlier. Mo, to, vous, li, sa, no or nous, vous autres, ye. This is how we say I, you, he, she, it, we, all, y'all, they. Mo, to, vous is the formal form. So even in Creole, we have a formal and informal, and we actually use it. Li, sa, no or nous, vous autres, and ye. Okay. 4 common verbs I wanted to throw at you. They probably all look familiar. Parler, to speak or to talk. Manger, to eat. Travailler, to work. Sourire, to smile. Parler, manger, travailler, sourire. And when we construct the sentence in Creole, it's a subject, verb, object order. So I speak Creole, mo parler Creole. You eat a lot, tu manges or tu manger plein. That's me. He or she works a lot, li travaille or travailler est. We smile, we don't smile. No souriez pas. Okay, so it's a recognizable syntax. It's the same as in English, subject, verb, object. And you'll notice with these verbs, which are all regular A verbs, we call them because they end in this sound, A. When we conjugate it in the present tense, it looks very similar to the infinitive of the verb. Actually, in Mont-Louis Creole and other places in southeast Louisiana, the infinitive is also the present tense form. So, mot parler, to manger, li travailler, no souriller. So we basically have two dialects of Creole. One is the one that was widely spoken in and around Mobile and along the Mississippi River in Louisiana. And then in Southwest Louisiana, where I'm from, there's another dialect, and they conjugate verbs differently. For important irregular verbs, gain, to have, gain. That's a hard one for lots of English speakers because it not only looks funny in terms of the writing, it also reminds you of gin, but it's not that kind of gin. And then there's the nasal "n", so it's gain, gain, to have, connaître, to know, dormir, to sleep, courir, to go. And those are four irregular verbs. So when we use them in sentences, they do not change form. They're the exact same. No gain piti, we have children. Ye connaît moins, they know me. Ye connaît moins. Ça dormit un tas, that always sleeps. For a person or a thing even. Mo courir l'ouvrage, I go to work. Okay, so subject, verb, object. And if you're wondering what the orthography looks like, so the way that we write the alphabet system, it's this orthography that myself and some other Louisiana Creoles came up with, which is a free resource. You can download it from the internet. You can just type Kouri-Vini orthography in Google and it'll show up. It's a PDF. It's like 20 or so pages. Nothing complicated at all. Has a few language examples in there as well. But it's a good resource. We use it all the time, even those of us who created it. Where can you learn the language if you'd like to? So on my website, Magasin LHCV, Louisiana Historic and Cultural Vistas, there's a language collection and also a map collection. Language collection includes audio courses as well as study cards that you can purchase. And then the map collections are one-of-a-kind maps that I created that are in Louisiana French, Spanish, and in Creole. They're the first maps in the world to be published in Creole, Louisiana Creole, Kouri-Vini. Okay, so it's a collector's item, and plus it's also cool to see the language used in an official way. So that's why we did that, and you can go there and make your purchases if you'd like. This is hot on the market. It came out last week to commemorate International Creole Heritage Month, which is October. So it came out October 1st. It's called Petit Livre Creole. And it's basically a primer or early guide to lessons in the language. And it has like 200 pages of everyday, ordinary conversation lessons for you to learn the language. Reading the language is really, really good for reading the language and understanding the grammar and all of its complexity. So that you can purchase on Amazon. It's $20 or so, and should arrive to you in like a few days. You can also take the language at Alliance Française de Lafayette. It's a course that's offered online, obviously because of the virus. And yeah, you can go there, you can take this class, and it's great. So that's, you know, if you need sort of the formal structure, that's a good place to take a class. All right, so Kouri-Vini, why do I use that? So it's an endonym. It's a name that Louisiana Creoles along Bayou Teche came up with for the language because of the way that we say to go and to come in the language. Kouri, to go, and come, Kouri-Vini. And that's to differentiate it from French. Of course, in French, it would be aller and venir. Similar kind of, but not the same. We use it more so today because of all of the confusion around Creole can be used to describe the French that's spoken in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, as well as the Creole language. So to avoid these issues, we use Kouri-Vini because it's only used to describe what is linguistically Creole. And like the brown pelican, which is the state bird in Louisiana, Kouri-Vini has been recognized recently as an endangered language. Yet despite the odds against the language and the bird, both are resilient and appear to be here for a while longer. Bien, merci. All right, that's it. I think I've gone over just a little bit. We can, I don't know what the timing is here, but I'm open to Q&A if you guys would like.
Ms. Marquita had a question in the chat. Can you see the chat?
Yes, let's see. How can I practice speaking this language, Kouri-Vini? Are there groups who regularly speak? So in terms of practice, there is a practice group on Facebook, but it has a maximum number of participants, and it's already reached that. It's at 1,000 right now. So keep an eye out for that. We usually, it's synced with the fan page. So whenever there are changes to the practice group or resources or things like that, we post that information on the fan page, so you can stay tuned there. But you can also use, I think Greg mentioned Memrise. Memrise has a free course on vocab for Kouri-Vini that you can use anytime. You can use it on your phone or on your desktop or laptops, which is really great. It drills you on vocabulary, but it also has pronunciation that you can use as well.
Dr. Landry, there was a word you used early on, and I'm not conversant to any degree in French. It was early on, engagé.
Engagé?
Engagé. Please tell me what that is.
Hired. Literally, it means hired. So those are Europeans that were hired on labor contracts. So engagé. Indentured servants, basically.
Ah, okay.
Dr. Landry, from Bill Summers, were there any German in the gumbo, e.g. from the German coast? Would some of them have adopted the Creole language?
Oh, yes. In fact, we think within one generation, so along the German coast in Louisiana, St. Charles Parish, St. John the Baptist, that area was settled in 1720, 1721. And within one generation, they were already speaking Creole down there, and as well as French. We don't really know how long German survived there, but we do know that they were definitely speaking those two languages within a generation. And so up until the World War II, when most of South Louisiana sort of succumbed to Anglicization, they were speaking Creole and French just like the rest of the parishes were. But vocabulary-wise, if that's what the question was really about, we don't have all that much vocabulary in Creole that comes from German. We have some foodways that we think comes from those settlers, like, you know, the sausages that we always have to have, and our red beans and our gumbo and our rice and gravy and everything else.
Earlier you had a slide, and the statement you made was that Kouri-Vini is a synonym in this instance to, I guess, the Creole language or whatever. So my question is, when is it not a synonym?
Kouri-Vini. So yeah, this is one of the nomenclature issues with the terms in English, because early on, even in the 1700s, 18th century, people who were speaking French, but who were from Louisiana, referred to their language as Creole, and that was French. But also people who were speaking Creole, what, you know, linguistically Creole, were also referring to it as Creole, So Kouri-Vini is the linguistically Creole version, if that makes sense. So whenever we use Kouri-Vini, it's to differentiate solidly from French, so that no one is confused about which language we're talking about. It's not the je suis, tu es, it's the mo, to, li, etc.
So is Mobile unique to using the term broken French?
No, not at all. That was used from the Great Lakes, even up in Canada, all the way down the Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast. That was a term that was used to help sort of diminish the usage of those languages, but also to psychologically trick people into devaluing that which was theirs and which was not American. And so here you hear people talk about, you know, broken French, and that term is used also in French and in Creole. Français cassé, mot parle cassé. You hear people say that all the time. And the younger generation, like my generation, who have a different interaction with the language, we are always constantly saying, well, what are you talking about? Like, it's a language, and if it's a language and you use it and you think about it and you think in it and you dream in it and you cook food in it and all these things, and it's as valuable and beautiful as any other language. So no, it's not broken, it's just local French or local Creole.
Make that same argument with regard to the use of the term broken English, which I hate.
Yeah, broken English. You know,
if it's a language, it's not broken. If it's functioning, then it's not.
That's exactly it. Yeah, right. I mean, it doesn't make sense. But when you come from that generation that was, you know, taught through schooling and also larger society that stuff that is non-standard is not valuable, then you can understand why people, without even thinking about it, just like repeats it over and over and over. And so when we come around and we say, of course, what are you talking about? Like, it makes perfect sense. Then that makes them think, and they think that we're weird.
Right.
Susan Pope would like to know what the name of the Creole app is that you mentioned.
So the app is Memrise.
Memrise.
Yeah, memrise.com. And if you just Google Memrise Kouri-Vini, it'll pop up. It's the one by Adrienne. She created the app.
Lashun Segura asked, would Pensacola Creole speak the same Creole language, or would it have been different?
That's a really good question. I don't know of any data on the Creole population linguistically in Pensacola. I know that there were Creoles there, Pensacola Creoles. It was an extension sort of Louisiana during the colonial period. I have relatives who lived there at that point, and then migrated to Louisiana proper. We just don't have the data on, the languages that were spoken at the time. We do know about Mobile area though, which is the exact same Creole dialect that's spoken along the Mississippi River and used to be spoken in Natchitoches Parish. Uses the same forms, everything.
I have a question. Oh, sorry. What is known about how the language changed when there was a large immigration of people from Haiti and from the Caribbean to the Gulf Coast? Did they learn the local language, or did they bring their own language and transform it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it has a lot to do with demographics. So Emily Clark, who's a historian at Tulane, she recently published American Quadroon, and she basically was interested in sort of the memory and the mythology around quadroons, quadroon balls. And because of that, she had to look at what was happening in terms of the free people of color and the free people of color from Cuba of Haitian descent and from Haiti that ended up on the Gulf Coast. And what she determined is that the men who were free men of color, when they arrived on the Gulf Coast, they married free women of color who were Louisiana Creoles. But that left a population imbalance, and so it left the free women of color who were of Haitian descent without partners who were free men of color. And so she says that this gave rise to these arrangements that are now called plaçage, in quadroon balls, so that they could be introduced to white men of means and could be kept and have children and things like that. And so in that sense, the free men of color who were coming from that refugee population were absorbed by the Louisiana Creoles because they married into the Louisiana Creole population, whereas the others for some time stayed somewhat separate, especially in New Orleans, because they weren't marrying into the Creole population, so to speak. And New Orleans is one of those places where the language sort of got suffocated the earliest, because it was the business center in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, and actually in the entire South. And so English became really, really important there early on. That's not to say that, pushing later into the 19th century and in early 1900s that there were people who spoke the language, did not speak the language there. There were people who still spoke it, but very often those people were coming from Mobile, from Biloxi, from Lafayette, from, outlying areas to work in New Orleans. And they were the ones ultimately who kept the language in the little form that it still existed in New Orleans. And so they were bringing in, the varieties from those areas. So we don't see, there's some syntactical and some lexical similarities between Kouri-Vini, Louisiana Creole, and Haitian Creole, but we can spot it straight away, the difference in them. For example, the possessives in Haitian Creole always follow the noun. So if I wanted to, in Louisiana Creole, they always come before the noun. So if I wanted to say my book, I would say mon livre, my book, mon livre. Whereas in Haitian Creole, they would say livre-moi. So the moi is the my, and it's after, always after. So that's just one example of it. We can, it's recognizable straight away.
Well, that takes us into another question from G. Dardeau, who asks, how do you distinguish between Creole and Cajun French?
Cajun is just Louisiana, it's French. It's Louisiana French, but that's also, it's also part of the nomenclature issues because lots of Cajun identified Creoles, I'm probably going to get arrested for saying this. Lots of Cajun identified Creoles because before the Cajun Pride movement of the 70s, the grandparents of the people today who identify as Creoles identify as Cajuns identified as Creole. And they practice Creole culture in every form. Because of the Cajun Pride movement, that movement encourages people to attach a Cajun label to everything locally. And so because they self-identify as Cajun, they also say that they speak Cajun French when very often they speak Kouri-Vini. So the way that we can tell which language they speak is by engaging them in conversation. And it's only until then we know, oh, okay, tapale Kouri-Vini, you speak in Kouri-Vini. And then they'll say, oh yeah, that's what people used to call it, but I'm a Cajun, you know? And so you're like, okay, that's like saying I'm American, but I'm not of British descent. I'm Creole, but you know, so it's the same thing. And that's a whole different conversation that I wish people would start exploring in dissertations and academic studies, because it's fascinating. It's a case of people practicing a culture but identifying differently and suffering some sort of like identity crisis because of that.
Marquita, you asked a question and I'm not sure exactly how to follow, and maybe you were asking Dr. Landry directly.
I was, yes, Tracy, I was. And again, I sent a piece of an email from when I downloaded your course. I purchased your course about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I downloaded, and that's why I asked the question about speaking with people around the course, because if you recall the format it was in back then, it was pretty much, I only listened. I really didn't talk with anyone. And the question I'm asking ultimately is that the current version, or is there a better current version that I should repurchase?
No, so there are two versions of the audio course, and both of those are centered around listening. And that's because it was designed first because think about when we're learning language or teaching language to children, it's all about listening and repetition, right? So that you get an ear for the intonation, the rhythms, and things like that. And then we go to the writing. So it was designed for the relearner, which is what Creoles are, relearners, to sort of acclimate to the linguistic sounds and rhythm. And then there's the memorize and then the practice group on Facebook where you can use it, learn the reading and the writing, and then practice it with other people in the group. Again, I don't know when the group is going to drop below the 1,000. We're always watching it because it's a hard place to enforce all the time, the rules. The rules really is that you have to practice the language at least once a week in order to stay in the group, because otherwise there are other people like you guys who want to get in and practice, but you know, there's dead space there. So usually what happens is when we start cracking the whip, so to speak, you know, we're going to start eliminating people because we don't see you practicing. That's when people start practicing again. And then, you know, it goes to this cycle like this very often. So yeah, you just have to keep an eye out for it. But that's a really good place also to make friends with other learners as well. So there are some people that I met there that I did not know in Louisiana who were from Louisiana, roughly around my age also, who spoke or who were relearning. And now I speak to them literally every day, only in Creole. and there are other people who are, establishing similar types of relationships, and they're able to use the language on a daily basis like that too. So just keep an eye out on the fan page, and we'll let you guys know when there are some spots for you to get in.
One last question that I have here from Donald Parker, and he wants to know is Kouri-Vini, is it also considered a patois?
Ooh, good questions. Yeah, you guys are full of good questions. So patois. Historically, that's not a term that our community, Louisiana Creoles, use. It comes from the Caribbean and seems to have been most common in the English-speaking Caribbean for any sort of non-standard form of a language. And so it depends. If you're in Jamaica, what they call patois obviously is not Kouri-Vini. Jamaican patois is English-based. It has nothing to do with Romance languages whatsoever. That's also the case in many other English, the Bahamas and other places. But if you're referring to the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Louisiana, Mississippi, then it depends, because some people may call Cajun French, Louisiana French patois. I only know if I hear you speak what you're talking. Jennifer Hayes, no, our moms, Jennifer.
Yeah, that's my line sister.
Oh, really? Yeah, my mom and her mom were really close. They were from the same place, the same New Iberia, and so we sort of grew up together, but we're not family. We're not related.
Now I remember she. I think there was a picture of her on one of your presentations. That's why I thought you might be related.
Oh yeah. When they were showing the physical descriptors.
Yeah.
Grief. Yeah. Small world. Yeah.
Do we have any additional questions from anyone? Facebook feed, anywhere? Wow, we have actually gone beyond our time. This has just been such a wonderful experience. Dr. Landry, I cannot thank you enough for this. I don't know if you've noticed and that we are having micro reunions throughout the month. And so we're gathering together, and Sean can actually speak more to that, since he and Ray and several other members are hosting those micro reunions throughout the week based on certain family groups to meet and greet and discuss history. I'm not good at this. Thank you. And everyone, just give him a round of applause, I think, because he just did such a great job. I mean, thank you. Is there a way to contact you that we need to, besides just on Facebook, is there another way that we contact you, or do you have a website that you want to share one more time? Or
yes, so the website is mylhcv.com. I publish, I'm trying to post it in the chat, but I can't. But it's, if you Google Louisiana Historic and Cultural Vistas,
okay.
That's my business and my website. I post lots of historical, cultural, linguistic stuff there. The shop where those audio courses and maps are is part of that website. And then from there, you can find me. My email address is on there. Yeah, I'm on social media as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank everybody for coming. And we're going to stop this live stream.
Thanks, guys. Waplita.
Thank you. All right. We've stopped the live stream, and so if anybody has anything they want to share or say or do. Barsha says thank you to everyone. Turn your mic on. Let's just say hello for a minute, everybody. There's Doris and Bernard and Lizzie. Oh, unmute, sorry. Yeah. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for coming, Bernard. It's nice to see your face. And Christophe is coming back.
Yeah, that was great.
Sorry, I left and I didn't. I realized after that you said we're going to stop the live stream, but not stop the whole thing. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. I just, that was really absolutely phenomenal, and I cannot thank you enough for being part of this. So
no, it's my pleasure.
And to actually, just to see you in your own little space
as a real person, huh?
As a real person, yes. Absolutely.
Absolutely awesome.
So what can we do better to make this better, everybody?
Good question.
Well, one thing I want you to do next time when you sign off on, before you sign off of at Facebook Live, just say goodbye to the people.
I thought I did. I think I said goodbye.
I mean, you kind of just said, yeah, you kind of just said, said, we're cutting it off, so maybe we could be nicer in our exit.
I like to be the person behind the curtain.
I do.
You have us wave, to be fair.
Where's the, where was it? Where was the Facebook Live presented?
On our Mobile Creole Cultural and Historical Preservation Society page.
Okay.
Do you not follow us? Shame on you.
I do, I think. I'm pretty sure I do.
In our group. I know you're in our group. Yeah. And then there's our page. We have a page. Because we actually got a 501c3, we're doing all
Yeah, that's great.
That kind of stuff. So it's these guys. And if you have not met Elizabeth Ferris, she is our librarian at Local History and Genealogy, and she's absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, we could not do any of this without her. So thank you, Lizzie.
Oh yeah. I thought I followed it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it should be there, and then our wonderful video people, Glenn and Sean, they'll probably do a little editing and then send it to our YouTube channel.
Cool.
So yeah.
So I get to show people always forget about Mobile Creole, so I always like to do my my spill that yes, Alabama is mostly Anglo, and yes, Mississippi is mostly Anglo, but
I don't, and maybe this is just me, it seems like most of the time when they think of Creole, they think of French. And we were Spanish occupied for so long, even after the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, we were still Spanish, for another 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the Florida. Florida is a whole different can of worms.
Yeah.
So I wonder the impact that has on that perception.
Mm-hmm. Any of you guys are from Ile Mont-Louis Island?
Mont-Louis Island. Who do we have still here? Bernard.
Yes, I am.
Bernard, Mr. Mosby. Yes, I asked because I'm wondering if so in 1994, let me look and see so I can get the date correctly. 1991, there was a linguist, Margaret Marshall, who did some field work in on the island, And I was wondering if some of these people were, no, some of them, so two of the informants, she says Christine Durrett was 92 at that time, and her sister Odessa Collins was 89, so definitely not still alive. But do you know of any other speakers still hanging around?
I don't know of anyone down there who's still fluent.
Who knows
my-
bits and pieces?
Right. So my grandfather, he passed away in 2000, and I would hear him as a child down there, maybe in the late 80s, early 90s. I think he might have been fluent because I would hear him, when he didn't want us to hear kind of where he was going with my dad. Maybe he would go into it a bit, but I don't even think my dad is fluent, but he knows some French. But so I don't know if he spoke it and my dad could just interpret what he was saying with, probably proper French.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know anyone down there who's still fluent. My granddad was a Durrett.
Okay, so so are those two sisters from your family?
I've got his genealogy here. Let me get their names again so that I can kind of try to find them in the tree. My mother unfortunately just passed about 2 months ago, and helping to kind of clean out some of that. I've got now a lot more of the records and a lot of old photos, so I'm starting to go back, and Dad's telling me some stories, and I've actually purchased the homestead there on the island, so I'm getting more into this and having to digest, more of the family history. So you said Odessa Collins, and who was the Durrett?
Yeah, Christine.
Christine. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we were cleaning up some trees down there after Sally, and Dad was talking to me about the folks who were opposite us, because Granddad had a place on the riverside as well as on the bayside. He was buying back some property there, just trying to buy up as much land as he could. And my dad was telling me about some of the aunts and uncles who were there, Durettes and some Lalondes. And so I'm just trying to jot all this down, while he's, with us. And I'm really just trying to absorb as much of it as possible. So I'll ask him about those two, and specifically about as much of the native Kouri-Vini speakers as possible.
Yeah, Chris Nordman knows about this particular. I'm not from that branch, but there's a Durrett, I think Nanette, who married into or had Rochon children for Augustus Rochon. So I wonder if that's must be related to you somehow.
Yeah, he was telling me about, and I wanted to write their names down because by the way he was saying it, I just couldn't. He was talking about I won't even attempt it. I wanted to say we had our arms full of like oak logs at this point, and I wanted to be like, could you spell that for me? But you could tell it was a nickname, and it wasn't on their birth certificate or their baptismal records. I've got some. I just wrote down the phonetic spelling kind of in my text message to myself is where I normally put this information.
Yeah.
I'll get him to sit down with me, and but yeah, Granddad had a great, I think, third cousin down there, Rosemary Butler, who did a lot of work, and she did his genealogy back to Maximilian Collins, and also on his other side, the Mosby side, which goes back to Mount Sterling through the Creek Indians as well. So I've got a lot of good background information to sort of sort through. But this was something interesting I wanted to do as well with the actual Kouri-Vini. Because there was a Maritime History of Mobile documentary that was done. And when they got to Montlouis Island, he immediately started with the Kouri-Vinis, just saying, the old folks, when they didn't want the kids to hear what we were saying. And he just kind of jokingly just started just saying some gibberish. But I was curious how fluent he actually was. And, but it was just kind of his way of just putting a flag in the ground for the history of the Bay and the Kouri-Vini. So I found it interesting. Now, another question, I didn't bring it up, but my dad also talks about a South Carolinian version of Creole. Perhaps, I don't know if it's actually accurate or not, but Geechee?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I didn't know if he actually even knew maybe the difference between the two.
Yeah, no, Geechee is an English-based language.
Okay.
It actually comes from Barbados. I think the
Okay.
initial populations that settled in South Carolina and some of those barrier islands were from Barbados that came up with their slaves, and they brought along their language with them. But it's not Romance language. Yeah, and today, there's a trend. This is a larger discussion, but that we can have later. But there's a trend in linguistics for linguists to sort of they themselves do it, but also encourage others to do it, to refer to non-standard forms and former colonies of people of color to be called Creoles. So now you hear English Creoles and you hear, Arabic Creoles and things like that. And so in the English Creole umbrella is Geechee and Jamaican Patois and Bajan in Barbados.
Gotcha. Yeah. I was even seeing this. I didn't watch much of it, but just an episode or two about on Netflix, even about Simon Bolivar. And I've heard them I heard that term come up, and it's not dubbed, it's in Spanish with the subtitles. And it kind of caught my mind that they even were, coming together to say that they were Creoles. Just, it seemed like they were just second generation, Spanish. And they're like, oh, he's Creole? Well, he's in the club then. I was like, oh, that's
yeah. They in those generations in the Spanish colonies, they did use it. Again, for the same reasons that we did, but because they became nation states early on, they no longer had a reason to continue self-identifying as Creole, because at that point there were Venezuelans, Mexicans, and whatever else.
Right. Interesting.
Chris may have more insight on some of this as well. I don't know anything about Pensacola Creoles, except that they existed, and when they existed, I don't know what happened to them after. Chris, do you know? You're muted.
There we go. No, not too much. No, I've done some research for the Pensacola people, but mainly only as it pertains to Mobile. I've gone through the St. Michael's Church records and gotten a number of items out of there, and bits and pieces, as I said, that pertain to Mobile, because at one point I'd like to make too is the migration of people all along the Gulf Coast. You find them in New Orleans, and then in Mobile, and then Pensacola, and even the priests themselves are going from place to place and pop up in the records. But offhand, I don't know too much in the way of formal historians, academics, people that have gone into the Pensacola stuff. Virginia Gould did some for her dissertation back in 1990, give or take a year or two, and has an article or two but she didn't specialize and centralize the work on Pensacola.
Yeah, there's not much. I mean, and it's it's interesting that they've sort of been overlooked, so to speak.
And I know why people have overlooked and never did the research, at least the kind of research that I did, because it's time consuming.
Yeah, there's the linguistic part, plus you probably have to travel there, and yeah.
Yeah, so it's, if somebody's ambitious, good luck.
Oh, Bernard, I'm very sorry to hear about your mom. And I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. Thank you so much, and to keep my dad in your prayers. They were together for a long time, gratefully, and he's doing all right. Just trying to keep busy, as you can imagine. A lot of memories.
Yeah.
Your dad, I said hello. Would you please? Tell your father I said hello, please.
I sure will. Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And we are all thinking of him. On a similar note, Christophe, have you heard from our patron saint of records, Mr. Winston DeVille?
No, but I know his cousin, Barbara Dejean. She was the archivist at the Diocese of Lafayette. And last time I spoke to her, which was 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, he was, in the nursing home with Lou Gehrig.
Yeah, in Opelousas. Yeah, so I just didn't know how he was doing with COVID and whatnot, if anybody had heard from him.
No. Earlier this year, someone posted he was correcting people because their St. Landry Parish Tourism Board had started billing Opelousas as the second oldest city in Louisiana, I think, or third oldest, but before New Orleans. And so he sent a message through a research and said, actually, that's not true. There are no records to support this. Opelousas was not founded in 1714 or 1715 or whatever. That was created at this point. So that was earlier this year he did that. So you just give you an idea. His mind is still there. Yeah, that's
that's
awesome. One of the great losses in the history and genealogy world.
Oh my God!
In terms of his output,
we acquired the remnants of his collection from the Mobile Genealogical Society when they closed. So we have, I don't know, 8 or 10 boxes of his work in our library.
Good.
So, yes, which is delightful. A lot of it's personal correspondence, which is quite interesting.
Good. Huh.
But yeah. Yeah, all his billing and whatnot.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, Winston and Jacqueline Voorhees and, all that gang, they just cranked out all of these, we're so indebted to them. All of us.
He was prolific. Oh my gosh.
I mean, yeah. So
anyway, well, I guess that's it, unless we've got anything else we really want to discuss, as far as how we can make it better each and every time. I don't know how it can get better than this, because this has been a great morning, and thank you, Christophe. Appreciate it.
No. It's like I said, it's my honor. I always tell people, and don't forget about Mobile Creoles. Always tell people.
Very much.
Somehow, against all odds, in a sea of Americains.
We're going, hey, we're over here.
Somehow, and hurricanes and everything else, you guys are against all odds. You're still hanging around, and that's amazing.
We are, potato sacks in the hurricane of 1906, and hey, we're good. All right. Okay. All right. Well, goodbye, everybody, and I will talk to you soon. And thank you so much for coming. And Ray, thank you for what you're doing, and everybody. So TTFN.
Take care, guys. Soin vous autres.
Bye bye.